Welcome to the monthly taping of Talking About Kids that's done live with an audience in conjunction with the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health. My name is Brad Snyder, and joining me from the Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health and FHIRe is Tracy Pedrotti. Hi, Tracy. How are you today?
Good. Thank you for including me.
Our guest today is Seanna Leath, and I'm very excited to talk with Seanna. Seanna is an assistant professor of psychology and brain sciences and affiliated faculty in women, gender, and sexuality studies at Washington University in St. Louis. And particularly germane to our discussion today is that she directs the Fostering Healthy Identities and Resilience Collaborative, or the FHIRe collaborative there. Um, Shauna, thank you so much for joining us. And I kind of want to start with I ask all my guests to kind of describe the history of their interests that got you to this point. So for you, it's like, what is the history of your interest in these factors that inform the positive development of Black youth?
I love that. And I was smiling about my lab acronym because it took me a long time, Brad, to come up with the FHIRe collaborative and to come up with the words for,
Love it.
that stood in for the acronym. So I still appreciate my creativity there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in thinking about a bit about my journey, I was identified as talented and gifted pretty early on when I was in fourth or fifth grade as a Black student in public school. Growing up, I grew up in Arkansas. And I was also first generation. So I was the first in my family to attend college, a four-year university. And when I first went to college itself, I remember kind of thinking, I'd received a lot of messages growing up about me being highly motivated and being really smart and doing really well in school and being a quote unquote good student.
Mm,
And I think when I got to college and learned more about research and that you could actually, there were community scholars and psychologists who were looking at development and youth development, I was really interested in this idea of, why are some Black students more motivated to be good students than others? And so I had kind of accepted the idea that there were like internal or individual level factors and differences in Black students around motivation. And so that was kind of where it started. Now, beautifully, what changed pretty early on when I went to grad school and I was a Africana Studies undergrad major and psych undergrad major was that I learned to shift the focus from thinking about individual student behavior and
mm.
thinking about how schools support kids and why for some students, educational settings aren't able to support them in ways that do help them feel motivated and engaged and wanting to stay involved in school. And so that was kind of the beginning, me shifting my thinking, even in my own experience, around like what were the things that the teachers really appreciated or they identified in me as like a promising student, a gifted Black girl early on, and how did that inform my educational pathway in ways that really worked out, right? Being the first in my family to
Right.
attend college, going to grad school, now being a career student. I'm a professor, like I'm just gonna keep this thing going. I'm still doing it. But then thinking about how can we make educational and school settings more affirming and supportive for all students, Black students, but period. And so that's what's continued to keep me in this work moving forward.
And I think you just did, but if you can, for the audience, talk a little bit more about how that is kind of being played out at FHIRe now.
Yeah, in the FHIRe Lab. So broadly, we focus on health and wellness for Black women and girls within family and school contexts. That's kind of my tagline. And some folks think, oh, that must be so specific because you all primarily focus on Black women and girls. And that's usually true. We focus on families, so we do have some work on Black boys and Black fathers. But when we really think about what goes into identity development, like
Mm.
what it means to raise a healthy adolescent in this day and age, right? Or a healthy Black girl in this day and age. There is so much involved. We have projects that range from thinking about beauty and body image and colorism. We have projects that look at teacher-student relationships and pubertal development for Black adolescent girls and how that might vary compared to girls from different racial groups or ethnic groups. We have projects that look at just achievement. So for instance,
Hmm.
why some Black girls are interested in math and STEM and how they persist and all the factors that contribute to that. And so, yeah, we primarily look at the messages, both gender and race, that are provided to Black girls within family and school contexts that allow them to just feel healthy and whole and confident in who they are. And we look at it primarily from early adolescence, so probably around like 10, 11, up through emerging adulthood, so around 25 or so.
So I think, longtime listeners of talking about kids might be, hearing what you're describing, and they might be thinking about Brofenbrenner's social ecological model here, these concentric circles that go about shaping our experience. So when you think about, well, let's just talk about the work of the FHIRe Collaborative. What have you discovered are some of those factors, both, and let's get away from the individual ones, because I think that's a big shift in your work. But when we think about some of those immediate environment and factors, in particular, because we have a lot of educators in the audience, what are those school factors that can work to make success more likely, or that can also shape or kind of diminish or suppress success?
I love that question. One, because I think one of the things that we try to do in the lab, which is a consistent challenge as we're working through projects, is even think about what we consider successful outcomes for kids, right? So even when we say, like, what do we mean by success? Is it that you earn an A in that class? Is it that you get a place on homecoming court, or you earn, if you're a track star, that you win a medal that season? Is it that you get into college? Is it like, what is your version of success? And then how can we support, Black girls or youth in reaching those? And so particularly, I would say, and I think, were you asking me about like what we found in terms of what's helpful? I also say this too. A lot of times what we find and publish, within our journal articles that we present in conferences, the things that are good for Black girls are good for youth in general.
Right.
And yet thinking about whether they have access to some of these factors is really where we get into kind of the discrimination, or thinking about like policies in schools. And so, for instance, we have some research out there that again looks at like pubertal timing. And we see that for Black girls, for instance, teachers tend to have higher academic and social expectations for Black girls because sometimes they look physically older than they are. And that's called adultification bias. And so when teachers have higher and developmentally inappropriate expectations, sometimes they tend to be harsher with these girls within classroom settings, which then undermines some Black girls' confidence and sense of engagement and belonging in the classroom. We know that positive teacher-student relationships, so having student teachers that are both affirming and also push Black girls in the classroom, can be important. That's important for youth in general, but sometimes there are these stereotypes or expectations that make those positive teacher-student relationships less likely to happen. We know that we have some work on, which I love this paper, on Black girl friendships, and the importance, again, of like social connection and social belonging, and the importance of Black girls being in programs that focus specifically on their identities in after-school programs or within school, and also just making connection to other Black girls from a very like pro-social standpoint. So sometimes we've also seen in the literature there'll be a focus on, for instance, like Black girls fighting, or even within like sexual health literature for adolescents, there will be a lot about sexual, like STIs or teenage pregnancy. And so one of the things that we do in my lab, we're also kind of flipping it and focusing on strengths. And so like what's going well within school context, what can we see that does speak to positive development? And it's interesting. So I'm in, a psych department. And I think sometimes we also see these trends within clinical psychology where there's a focus on pathology, but there is a need to also focus on positive mental health. And what are the things that are supporting like hope and wellness and these positive outcomes that we want for folks? And so doing kind of that same twist for Black girls. And in terms of some of the things that diminish it, that's a big question. So I might just return to it as we continue to talk. One of the things that comes up again and again is usually disciplinary surveillance. And surveillance comes in a lot of different forms. So it can be something as small as making negative comments again about what Black girls are wearing to school. So then, especially during the adolescent period, girls might be paying more attention to like, oh, this is like what I'm wearing or how I look versus like, here's what I'm learning in the classroom, or my ideas are important. We see just in terms of being sent to the office for being disrespectful, for talking back, for like tone policing comes up a lot. I think this is also just generally true for youth, but certain emotions. There's also a notion of like racializing emotions where when Black children are angry or they're sad or it's not like happiness or they're not, maybe adhering to like social norms or rules in the classroom in the ways they're expected, they tend to be sent out of class or sent to a principal's office, or they get comments from their teacher about, that's not appropriate, that's bad, X, Y, and Z. And so we see that relating to decreased engagement and a decreased sense that like my teachers care about me, which is important. So that's one of the things that's promotive, right? Just feeling that sense that they believe I'm capable and they also care about me and how I'm doing.
Yeah, it seems to me that and if I'm betraying my ignorance here, I apologize. But it seems to me that there's this really fine line um, in that trips up Black girls in particular between like looking at their strength, taking this strength-based approach, and then and the line goes between recognizing a strength but then maybe assuming a a callousness. I want to be very careful with my words here, but it was in a comment that you made before where we assume and maybe an emotional, and this is in some of your research as well, we assume an emotional maturity or we assume a lack of sensitivity because that they are capable of handling greater stress because of assumptions about their history or their identity. And so when you talk about like how do you teach to their strength, but then also recognize that they share vulnerabilities with everyone, with all of us. Do you find that that's a tricky thing, or am I just am I projecting too much on how I might
No,
be able to do it or not do it?
you are not projecting at all. And I say this, I value education as a system so
Hmm.
much. And I value the work that educators K through 12 do on a daily basis. Like I cannot understate that at all, or overstate that at all, I would say. And when we're thinking about, it's interesting because you're bringing up notions of like the strong Black woman schema or the
Yeah.
superwoman schema, which again, with adultification bias, part of it is that Black girls are aged to be older than they are. And so even notions of strength or being able to weather adversity are placed on Black girls very early on. Now, before that, I also want to say I am also fiercely protective of Black children's childhood,
Mm.
notions of childhood. So what you're also speaking to is even this sense of like Black girls not being able to make mistakes. So even if there is a rule violation and they've done something they are not supposed to do in the classroom, or I'm even thinking about there was instance, I think it was either North Carolina or South Carolina several years ago. It was a 15-year-old Black girl, Shakira, I think is like the name they released. Her name was protected, but she wouldn't give up her phone in the classroom.
Mm.
She was also in the foster care system, and I think she got an attitude with either the teacher or the security resource officer that was in the classroom, or maybe both of them. And so, what went viral was that she was flipped out of her desk. And they got the cell phone, and I think she was dragged out of the classroom. They caught it on video, and I'm not sure what happened with the school resource officer. But to your point about this perception of Black girls as stronger, able to handle whatever, in that moment, we could see a child in distress, even if she's responding. She's saying, I'm not giving you my phone. No,
Right.
F off, whatever it is. But the response to that was to escalate versus to de-escalate and say, oh, there's a child in need here. How can I, like, okay, she's not giving me my phone right now, but it's a distraction for the classroom. Will you step outside with me? Like, if you need to take that call. At the same time, I have so much respect for educators where like you're doing this so much, oftentimes potentially with other students. In terms of the strength piece, what I'll say there is that we see for Black girls, and then again, as they develop into young women, with the strong Black woman schema or the superwoman schema, we see emotional suppression that
Hmm.
happens very early on, where, this sense of like, I can't be vulnerable, or when I express my emotions, again, especially maybe anger, sadness, it not being received well, or receiving kind of like maybe a callousness or disregard from some teachers. And so that, again, like shutting girls down more often if it doesn't feel like a safe space. With the strong Black woman schema, if you have these notions of strength, you might be less likely to seek help or to seek social support when you are experiencing a challenge. The tricky part about that schema in particular is that it's also framed in a very positive way.
Right. So
Very,
so I need you to pause for just a second because
yeah, I'm sorry.
I
I'll just
I
keep going.
I'm with you and
Yeah.
I kind of set you up for this because I said that I wanted you to talk about this, but I need to make sure that my listeners understand what
Mm,
you mean by
okay.
the superwoman schema because I
Okay.
find it's a really important part of your work. So if you could
Okay.
just for a moment define it for everybody, and then we're going to get right back into
I
that
can.
discussion.
Hey, Interrupt me anytime. Thank you. Because the other piece about this, when you do something all the time, you just make assumptions about everybody's having the same conversation. So I
Right.
appreciate that. The superwoman schema is a gendered and racialized identity schema or a stereotype of Black womanhood that is rooted back even to enslavement, where Black women were expected or were perceived as being stronger or superhuman. There are within the superwoman schema, it was popularized or was published on by Cheryl Giscomé, a clinical psychologist. There are five main tenets. I might miss one, but I'll generally say them. And so it's strength despite adversity. So an obligation to present an image of strength. There's an obligation to be independent, and so to resist dependence on other people or vulnerability. There's an obligation to take care of others at the expense of yourself. There's also being able to persevere despite having limited resources. And that limited resource part is really important because like persistence is not an issue. But for instance, there's this proverb that's like, Black women can make $1 out of 15 cents. And so it's like, if we think about wage gaps or wage disparities, Black women making like 67 cents to every dollar for white men, and yet you have to pay for the same things for housing, education, et cetera. There's only so much you can do individually to overcome systemic things like wage disparities, right? And then what was the other one? I'm probably forgetting it. But the superwoman schema or the strong Black woman schema, we also see it play out in places like in healthcare, where Black women are less likely to be believed about their pain and less likely to receive pain medication or adequate healthcare access. So we see that playing in. We see it play in when there's an expectation, for instance, maybe Black moms or Black women take on 2 jobs to make ends meet, and we think like they're just able to handle it. Within our society being the US, we have very meritocratic, individual, that individual meritocracy ideas where it's like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you work hard, you can achieve anything. And sometimes what that does for Black women or other structurally marginalized communities, the assumption is just push yourself harder and harder and harder versus having social safety nets. And so that starts playing out very early, sometimes for Black girls or Black kids or other youth, where we're not like supporting them social, like again, with the safety net of like social supports versus thinking they can just keep going and they can manage it themselves. Was that helpful?
It's super helpful. And again, longtime listeners of Talking About Kids will recognize that this was important. We had Sanjata Aya on, and he was talking about this inside the child welfare system and how that has really worked to undermine some family structures by assuming that, just the mother can handle all of this on her own. So thank you for giving us that definition. I have to imagine also that, if you, and again, I want my listeners to be thinking about how this plays out in their own program, in their own classroom, because it is, and it's not the same. I think that some people might be thinking, well, this isn't the same as having a derogatory view of somebody. But the notion that we can, assume that we don't allow for a vulnerability, that we don't allow for the need for help, can be just as damaging. And that's what your research is pointing out, right?
It can. And that's a bit, so compared to other stereotypes of Black women and girls, so there's like the Jezebel or the hypersexual Black girl or Black woman, or compared to the mammy, which is a stereotype of Black women as like larger, darker skinned, asexual Black women, kind of like Aunt Jemima, who take care of white families. The strong Black woman schema is a positive stereotype, right? That's generally, it's like, oh, it's Michelle Obama, it's Serena and Venus Williams, it's, all these Black women it's Kamala Harris. And yet we also know that it can be maladaptive, particularly relating to mental health outcomes and particularly relating to social connection. And so what I also love about some of the work that's coming out, one, it's continuing to talk about the potential mental health effects for Black women and Black girls around stress, anxiety, and depression. But it's also saying like, oh, it can be adaptive in some ways. Like, yes, keep persisting because gendered racism is real. And sometimes we have to be twice as good to get half as far. And yet also realize all the coping tools and realize like this is a burden you shouldn't have to bear. So it is, to your point about being a fine line, it's a balance and making sure we're providing Black girls with messages about, here's the truth behind the stereotype. We also love that you're persevering and we know this trope, and yet also realize like it can be detrimental and how can you make sure that you don't experience these effects and be in conversation with families about it too.
And I do want to go back to something you said very on, which is a lot of the strategies that we can use to promote. And again, we're going to say success, even though that's a
No, no,
charge.
it's
So,
fine.
oh, like
Objective.
Sean, I've had a whole half-hour debate with somebody about what success means for kids.
Okay,
I
okay.
get it.
I was like, I am
I'm
not trying
fully
to
there.
critique your
No,
use of
no,
it. Yeah.
I'm on your side. Um, but but we'll use it as a placeholder. But uh, you said early on that some of the things that we can do work for all kids, and I want to just reinforce that with this idea that the how somebody's body is developing, how a student's
Yep.
body is developing, is not on one-on-one with how they are developing emotionally. We actually know this from the bullying literature very, very well, and from the obesity literature very, very well. And that we assume that kids that develop sooner are older on the inside because their bodies look older, and they're
Yep.
not. And so that's a
Yes.
really simple thing that we can do. If you're a 12-year-old, you're a 12-year-old. You're not an 18-year-old. Even if your body, if I perceive that your body looks older to me, you are a 12-year-old, and I should treat all my 12-year-olds as having the same amount of emotional development, at least assuming that they do, right? We have a question here from somebody listening, and the question is, what is something I can do as a program manager who supports health clinics to be more
Mhm.
inclusive and to help reinforce affirming and inclusive care of Black youth who identify as female?
Yeah, and so that's a great question. One, the type of health clinic would be useful to know, but that's okay if I don't.
Right.
So affirming and inclusive. It's interesting, Brad, even as you were talking, one thing that I mentioned it earlier, I'll say again, my underlying assumption, one, I'm also a parent. So I'm a scholar, but I'm also a mom. Okay. Um, is that kids do well when they can. And so when they are not doing well, what is it about the environment that needs to change, or what needs to happen with the adults or the caregivers in their lives that we can alter to better support them? Versus assuming, I think this happens with Black kids, but it also happens with children more broadly. They are criminalized, or they are talked about as though they are intentionally misbehaving or intentionally doing things to upset adults or to
Right.
break rules, right? And so I think around the notion of being affirming and inclusive, some concrete things are seeing, like, what is not working, who are the students or youth who are doing the worst, and what is going on with them. Like, if you can talk with them or their parents or folks who are supporting them to say, what isn't working about the system, and what is within our power and control to actually change to work with youth who are struggling the most. And I say struggling intentionally versus saying, like, oh, they're misbehaving, or again, they're trying to break the rules or just go outside the confines. And I also mentioned this in particular, having more experience now, or getting into more work with special education, and also thinking about disability and neurodivergence with Black children, because this comes up a lot when, again, social norms or educational settings that are set up for neurotypical kids or able-bodied kids do not work, right, and are not designed to work with neurodivergent or disabled youth. And so, let me see, I don't know if I have other specific recommendations that come to mind now, but a guiding kind of framework that we use in the lab, and we're like working on some of the research, is to think about what isn't working for some of our
Right.
kids or families, and then going from there and talking with them.
Mhm.
And then also seeing within the organizational constraints of a setting, because there can be resources, it can be time, it can be staffing issues, it can be, here are the safety policies we have in place. What can be changed or modified based on the feedback that we're getting? Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think that it emphasizes that we're working with systems that weren't designed for youth and for youth of color. And we want to have high expectations, and we want, all young people to succeed, quote unquote.
Right.
And we have to appreciate that the way we're doing work, the structures that we're working in, mean that we have to change our approaches, as opposed to expecting an adolescent to have all of these things readily available to them.
And it's a shift. I think also,
It's a
even
shift.
sometimes trusting kids with their perception. Like, I think there are certain ideas we have about childhood and adolescence that we have to work on shifting if we're really going to bring them into many of these conversations, where I think kids are assumed to be unreliable narrators, and some kids more than others. And I say unreliable narrators in terms of like this is their experience, and the importance of their experience within a school setting, within a program.
Right.
And maybe we can't do everything. Like my kids, my 3 and 4-year-olds, they'll tell me all sorts of things, or something. I'll be like, that's just not quite what happened. And, or like mom is not able to make that unicorn appear. Right. And so, but again, there are limits to it, but also taking seriously, like, okay, if I can't do a unicorn, like maybe there's an interest in horses, or maybe we can go do X, Y, and Z. And I saw it was a TikTok or something. And it was a young man talking about one of the most powerful things his parents did for him is they were asking him, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? What are your values? Like, what do you care about? Was whatever he would tell them, they would find some way to plug in and kind of build on that interest. And so I think his example was that he wanted to be a shark trainer. And he, in fact, he was like, I am not a shark trainer. Now he's an adult, so he identified this when he was 4 or 5. But he was like, but what my parents did do is they put me in swim lessons because they were like, well, if you want to be a shark trainer, you probably need to know how to swim, and you're probably going to have to go to college because it's probably going to require some kind of degree. So they found something, and they also listened to him and took him seriously.
Right.
And he was like, that can be so important for any adults to do. But again, it requires like a listening to youth and to kids about like things that are important to them and not trivializing it. And I think that can be even more difficult. We found with some of our students, one of our middle school programs of Black girls, they were with some of the girls who were most likely to be suspended or expelled. We lost one girl in the middle of our program, actually. And so I was going to say, sometimes that's even more difficult when you're working with youth, that you're like, they're not working with you. And so it's easier, or they're bringing up, or they're triggering a lot, maybe for individual adults working with them, or for the program, they're causing difficulties. But sometimes I say like that's when it is most important to do that deep dive work and to really like work with those kids and listen to them. So
I have another question for you here, Seanna, and that is there other literature or resources, apart from visiting the website of the FHIRe Collaborative, and the link to that will absolutely be in the the link to that will absolutely be in the show notes. But are there other things other literature or resources that you recommend?
For Black youth, I would say Rihanna Anderson does some great work. She has an embrace intervention that talks specifically about, like, if you're talking about racism and race with Black youth and thinking about positive development within families. So that intervention has its own website. Other resources, I would say if you look up or generally search for like culturally relevant interventions for Black youth and Black families, there is more out there. I think resources, I'm just broadly even thinking about books like How to Talk So Kids Will Listen. Some of those basic things, again, where it's like if we can improve just communication patterns or lessen some of the power dynamics between adults and kids and educators, and think about like, what am I bringing into these interactions? Right. I've found that really useful as a parent and as a scholar, to think about like, how do we go to some of those foundational building blocks? Even when you were mentioning like Bronfenbrenner, that ecological systems model, there's a great one that was redesigned by Jessie Stern and colleagues, and she was talking about attachment theory, but it was specifically for Black youth. And so it was Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model, but it also had things like generational trauma, and it had like policing and Black Lives Matter. It had colorism. It had things that like Black parents and Black youth have to think about that are still within that broader like family, school, social media, macro context, but it's specific to like the history of Black folks in the US, right? To have positive youth development. So Jessie Stern's work around attachment is really great. Other resources I don't know, I'm going to continue. Oh, there's a great, I'm a book person. I would recommend books all day long. I think it's by Trisha Green, and it talks about raising free Black children. And it's like, it's a book, but it's also kind of a workbook. And I think it's useful for parents and educators because, again, it has interactive activities. It has a number of like topics related to sexual health, related to thinking about discipline and the values that you might have as a family or within school for your kids. So that came out just a couple of years ago. I would also... I'll probably keep going back to this because I think it's a conversation that isn't happening enough in some spaces. If you look up resources, again, around disability and neurodivergence for Black youth, that's great because you get these intersections of thinking about racism and thinking about ability status, and also sometimes thinking about gender in more inclusive and affirming ways. And I think sometimes folks are maybe talking about disability or neurodivergence, but primarily for white youth, and also thinking about race and gender and how it might show up differently. And so I'm happy to talk more about that if you want to, but yeah, looking up some affirming Okay, I want to give one specific example if I can really quick. Is that
Absolutely.
okay? Okay.
Please.
So for instance, Black youth, Black boys in particular, but also Black girls, they're more likely to be diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder,
Yeah.
attention deficit disorder, or pathological demand avoidance, PDA. Again, a lot of these are around having issues with attention, having issues with authority, not being willing to listen or comply. But there are more affirming neurodivergent ways. So pathological demand avoidance being reframed around persistent drives for autonomy. Because what you get are youth who might be diagnosed or characterized as having PDA profiles, which is also associated with autism or again, ADD. What they want is the ability to have choices about their lives. And so when I mention this in relation to Black youth, you might have these diagnoses, and sometimes there's also underdiagnoses for Black kids, right? Like being mistreated,
I was
misdiagnosed,
going
or
to say
getting
that. Yeah.
exactly, right? Getting diagnoses later in school or later where they weren't able to get the supports they needed earlier on. But the diagnoses being more so framed around like, again, they're just acting up or they're unwilling to be compliant versus what if they want to be more autonomous? Are there ways to set up the classrooms or to talk with them in ways where they do have these choices? And do you then see a change in behavior, like the framing of how you're talking and engaging
Well,
with them?
and look, this is a podcast, and you can see the video of this if you're live. So you're not going to be up, you're not going to actually be able to see me step up on my soapbox, but I'm about to do it because it really matters also who is making this diagnoses and where they are in the literature and where they are in the science. Because that oppositional defiance is a trigger for me because we know the number of children that received that as a diagnosis against what the DSM said, and really what they are is trauma sensitive, that they are
Mhm.
reacting predictably to stressors. And
Mhm.
that's not what oppositional defiance is. So you can change the behavior by changing the stressors, by creating these environments that, as you so eloquently pointed out, enable them to succeed. Look at what is causing that behavior and don't pathologize a predictable reaction given somebody's history with traumatic events, potentially.
And
Okay,
I
I'm
think
off of my soapbox now.
no, you stepped down. You stepped down. We can't see it, but you stepped up and you
That's
stepped
right.
back down. That's great. I think the other thing that so when I'm thinking about adolescence as well and thinking about even the time we're in, but period in history, one thing and something that I want for my kids and also the students that I work with, I want them to be growing into young adults who can think through their choices and
Yeah.
also know themselves, like as they continue to deeply know their values, and even when they are, neurodivergence disabled, maybe they speak a different language, maybe they're coming from an immigrant household where they also have like some acculturation things going on. They have to have opportunities to practice and model, like, how do I want to show up in the world? And so the other piece is that, maybe not being diagnosed with ODD, but if it's PDA or something else, like, we have to help them know themselves. And I think sometimes when we
Mm.
assign things or we
Those
don't
labels.
offer youth enough chances to do that and also mess up. And so, for instance, one of my sons, he has ADD, and I want him to understand here's when my brain is so busy when it's going. Like, do I want to quiet it or am I having a creative burst and I love this moment and like, we're gonna rock with it. And I think that like but one of the things that's a challenge is if you're within inflexible systems. So we kept him in a Montessori school environment because we thought that public school would be too traditional in certain ways around how he can move his body or not, how he has to write or sit down. And I was like, I don't want him to get characterized as a bad student as he's learning to read and as he's figuring these things out. And so I just think it's so important, even heading into adolescence and young adulthood, where it's like, then I can think, what type of job, how do I want to make money? If I need to make money
Yep.
for a living, what does that look like? What is my version of success? What type of life do I want to lead? What does it mean to be an engaged citizen in my community or in society? And I think when kids have so much constricted on them or told this is what you do and this is how you show up and this is what you should think, it severely limits their ability to figure that out for themselves.
Read.
Seanna, our time here goes very, very quickly,
Yes.
and especially with a topic as rich as yours. But I do want to take this moment just to thank you so much for your work. I hope it's going to continue, and I hope that you'll continue to help all of us, help all of the kids with whom we work. Tracy, I want to share a little bit about what's going on with the Alliance. Let me bring that up for you here, if you want to talk about that.
Thank you, Shauna, for joining us today. I'm very excited to reflect on some of the notes that I've written here. And so just a little overview. The Arizona Alliance for Adolescent Health is essentially a coalition of healthcare and social service providers in Arizona that are really intentionally working to improve the systems that young people interact with or will interact with as they, go through the many stages of adolescence. And so we have various interventions, and one of the opportunities we have is to partner with Brad on these podcasts as an opportunity to uplift adolescent health and support those who are in direct service with young people so that they also feel confident and competent to provide quality care for young people. So we just encourage folks to visit our website where you can find lots of resources, and we'll need to put Seanna's stuff up quick. And you can access resources and training opportunities and other supports to improve our efforts to support young people.
Excellent. And for those of you who really feel like this is just scratching the surface and you want more, know that we're not expecting Seanna to do all the lifting herself around the issues that impact Black kids in particular. Next week, we're going to be hearing from Mavis Sanders about her work on supporting emerging young adults and the kind of environments that those young adults say that they need in order to become independent, successful adults. So please tune in for that. And thank you all. And thank you, Seanna.
Thank you for having me. Great.
Take care.